Bien, a continuación entonces tenemos la siguiente ponencia. Lamentablemente quiero comentarles que la doctora Meriel, que estuvo también el día de ayer con nosotros, sin embargo, ayer estuvo de manera presencial, sin embargo, en esta segunda participación, su ponencia va a estar grabada. A este respecto, si existiera alguna pregunta o algún comentario, comentario sobre la temática, se va a establecer también un mecanismo de comunicación para poderles enviar las respuestas a sus inquietudes, ¿no? Entonces, la doctora Meriel Moore Coyle, quien ahora va a participar con la ponencia El Caballo Sibilante, Asma, Equina, nuevos conocimientos sobre las causas, el diagnóstico y la prevención. Me voy a permitir, a pesar de que ayer ya se hizo mención de su currículum, sin embargo, no todos estuvieron el día de ayer en esa presentación, por lo tanto, voy a comentar lo siguiente. Ella está adscrita como directora de investigación e intercambio de conocimientos en el Royal Agriculture University, en el Reino Unido. Su formación hizo un bachillerato en ciencias en Agriculture University College, en Escocia. Tiene un PhD de nutrición equina por la Universidad de Edimburgo, con un proyecto titulado como Estudios sobre la cinética de degradación de alimentos fibrosos botánicamente diversos y su aparente digestibilidad y velocidad de paso cuando se alimentan a ponis. Entre sus diversas actividades, ella ha sido profesora de ciencias equinas y animales en tiempo completo en la Universidad de Gales. Es profesora de ciencias equinas también en tiempo completo en el Colegio Agrícola de Gales. Es consultora en nutrición e investigación equina. Es subdecana en el Colegio Abierto de Ciencias Equinas en Edimburgo. Es profesora principal en el Royal Agriculture College, Cirencester, a medio tiempo. Entre sus diversas actividades profesionales es miembro de la Sociedad Británica de Ciencia Animal. En el 2003 formó parte del comité organizador de las conferencias sobre ciencia equina emergente. En el año 2005 es parte del comité organizador de las conferencias sobre aplicación de ciencia equina. Es miembro de la Sociedad Promotora de la Excelencia en Ciencias Equinas y asesora de acreditación de la Sociedad de Biología. Entre sus diversas líneas de investigación tenemos nuevos piensos y sistemas de alimentación para ganado joven, alergenos respiratorios, identificación y sistemas de tratamientos de forrajes, perfil microbiano del forraje y contenido de nutrientes en relación con la salud intestinal, la salud respiratoria, el entorno estable y los sistemas de mitigación. Además, también participa en líneas de investigación o lleva a cabo estas líneas como sistemas de alimentación y comportamiento y bienestar en equinos, fisiología digestiva y salud intestinal, requerimientos energéticos de los caballos en ejercicio o en actividad de ejercicio, y entre sus publicaciones cuenta con más de 30 publicaciones científicas, tiene 57 resúmenes en conferencias y tiene 5 capítulos de libros. Entonces, los dejo con la presentación de la doctora Meriel Moore. Gracias.
Okay, well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Yesterday, I spoke about one of the challenges that we have with, when keeping horses in stables, and that's to do with respiratory health. So this talk is going to concentrate on basically wheezing horses, horses that have got problems, respiratory problems that affect their performance or indeed affect their welfare. Now, over the last 5 years, my group has been working specifically on equine asthma and the dust that comes from the stable environment and what aspects of that dust horses are allergic to. And in his work, and it was my PhD student, Sam White, in his work, he has developed new diagnostic techniques and indeed discovered lots of new airborne respirable dust particles that we previously didn't know horses were allergic to. So that is essentially what I'm going to be talking about today. So why am I worried about airway disorders in horses? Well, actually, inflammatory airway disease, which is one on the equine asthma spectrum, is the most chronic airway disorder of athletic horses. And in fact, in the UK, 80% of young thoroughbreds in their 2-year-old season have either currently got or have had an episode of inflammatory airway disease. So there is evidence there in these horses of being hypersensitized. And that hypersensitization is a reaction to the environment that they are currently in. IAD is also the second most common cause of loss of use to horses, these young race horses in training, and indeed the second most common cause that people have to call the vet out. So this is a big issue in race horses, and we've known about this for quite a while. But back in 2017, Vincent Scherber wanted to know, was there a similar incidence of airway disorder in performance horses? So he surveyed a range of horses in different activities in Germany and Switzerland. So he looked at 2 sets of show jumpers, he looked at a group of eventers, and he looked at a group of endurance horses. And rather shockingly, you see the total on the left-hand side there, the total column for the number of respiratory disorders or the percentage of respiratory disorders in these groups of horses were between 85 and 95%. And that's a staggeringly high number. But what was also concerning for me in this particular survey was that of the eventers, and these would be the next group of horses that would really need to work quite fast because they gallop, and they gallop for extended periods, maybe over anything between young eventers from 2 miles to 4 miles when they're doing big events. And 40% of those horses were suffering from severe equine asthma. So this is why I'm worried about this condition, because it really does affect our performance horses. Looking at severe equine asthma, which is the severe aspect, the more challenging aspect of this condition, even in our background population in the UK, and it's accepted to be the same in Europe, 14% of horses have this respiratory condition. So 14% of horses who are just what we would call happy hackers, just horses that are used for pleasure riding, and they are kept in conditions that initiate respiratory disorders, and it does affect their welfare. We do see an increased risk as horses get older, and this is what indicates to us that it's all to do with the stable environment, because horses who are greater than 4 years old seem to come up more with severe equine asthma, as indeed do thoroughbreds. Now that's to do with the fact that thoroughbreds don't really go out in the field when they're in training, so they spend their time in stables and are therefore continually exposed to airborne respirable dust. We get a higher incidence of severe equine asthma during winter and spring in Northern Europe, because for whatever reason, we can't put our horses out on grass. And most of it's to do with the wet and the grass is not growing. And so horses are kept indoors or in these artificial environments for longer. We also see a high prevalence of horses in the urban environment, and I'll tell you a little bit more of the reason behind horses who are living on the edge of cities and in towns, why they are more susceptible to this condition. Horses that have suffered from a respiratory disorder or a respiratory infection, so I'm talking about either equine flu or herpes virus, anything that affects the respiratory tract, during that process of that infection, the physical changes that occur in the trachea and in the bronchioles, where the villi actually shrivel and become quite compromised, that is a very, if you like, dangerous situation for horses to be exposed to high levels of dust. Because what happens is the dust goes into the lungs, and instead of being caught on that mucociliary escalator, which is beating and taking it out of the lungs again, those particles actually come in contact with the basal membrane in the lung tissue. And it starts to set up the hypersensitivity reaction because the body recognizes them as non-normal. They shouldn't be there. The other thing that really increases the risk of this condition is feeding dry hay and bedding on straw. Now, we've known this for quite a long time, and probably out of all of those things, that is the biggest risk to horses for respiratory disorders, is this bedding on hay, bedding on straw and feeding dry hay. But there is another aspect to this condition. Sometimes you will people will say to me, well, my horse doesn't cough. And there's a horse next door, he's coughing, but my horse doesn't, and he's on exactly the same regime. Well, there is a heritability, there is a familial link here with RAO. And what we find is that this severe equine asthma, previously categorized as RAO, the offspring of horses of the sire that has had a respiratory disorder is 4 to 5.5 times more likely to come up with that condition, to actually become respiratory compromised themselves. If both the sire and the dam have had a history of respiratory disorder, then you get up to nearly a 50%, so 44% chance of the offspring also developing respiratory disorder. So this is a situation where we should actually, instead of hiding, oh, well, there's nothing wrong with the stallion and there's nothing wrong with the mare. In fact, we should tell people if respiratory disorder has been in the parents, because respiratory disorders are actually only switched on when those animals are exposed to dust. So if you know that your young horse has an increased likelihood of becoming respiratory compromised, then you can change the management system or keep it outdoors, or use some of the active stabling that I was talking about yesterday, where horses are outside most of the time and have areas to go into and lie down if it's wet, etc. Then you knowing that you've got a susceptible horse, if you keep it in those conditions, the likelihood is it will be respiratory disorder free. So knowledge is power, as always, and it's important to know these things. Having said heritability, unfortunately, it's not just as simple as saying, well, we know that this particular family, we can pick up that gene on a particular chromosome, and we know that these particular horses are more susceptible to this condition. Because different families of different breeds actually have slightly different susceptibilities, and different genes seem to be causing the problem in these horses. Several studies at the moment point to interleukin-4R, but it's by no means cut and dried. So there is definitely some sort of family link, but being able to test and say, well, we have a genetic test and that horse is definitely going to be susceptible to respiratory disorder, we're not there yet. We can't do that yet. So I just said the number of horses that have respiratory disorder, and what it affects, but why are we worried about this? Why am I actually worried about respiratory disorders in these horses? Well, it's down to this. And this is quite simple. In fact, we've known about it even longer than before Snow and Vogel actually produced this graph in 1987. Horses that have got severe equine asthma or recurrent airway obstruction are able to shift only half the amount of air out of their lungs during that phase in the stride in comparison to horses who have normal lungs, who don't have compromised lung tissue. Now, when you think that the respiratory function and stride are synchronized, it's very important that the horse is able to breathe in at certain stages of his stride and to breathe out. It is very short time indeed to be able to do that effectively. So if during that time, and that half of the stride, the horse is only able to empty half his lungs because his lungs are compromised, then he will also only be able to bring in fresh oxygen in the other half of the stride because his lungs are already full of air. Now that has a very serious knock-on effect for the oxygenation of the muscles and of course the blood. So the blood that's going round the alveoli just simply does not have access to enough oxygen. In fact, the animal becomes what we call hypoxic. So it's actually really suffering from a lack of oxygen. So although the heart rate is going hard and pumping the blood to all different areas of the body, we find that we're not actually delivering sufficient oxygen to the working muscle bed. So this means that these horses very quickly become fatigued. Now, for very short runs and sprints, that might not be a big problem. But for horses that are galloping and doing any sort of aerobic work, that is a huge problem. But this is also a welfare issue as well, because these animals are being asked to work and they are suffering. They cannot do it. They will be suffering from cramped muscles and under significant stress. So this is why we're very concerned about this condition. If horses have got what we call IAD, inflammatory airway disorder, and these were all recategorized long after this graph was produced, that is what most people identify as loss of performance. And they rather handily sit somewhere in the middle so that they're breathing in and out, in between 50 and 100%. So it might be 65, the less severe ones might be 70, 80%. But they've still got compromised lung function. Now, when you're training a horse for whatever activity you do, the one limitation that there is on the physiology of training are the lungs. The lungs are the lungs. You can't train them. You can't make them take in or breathe out more air or more carbon dioxide. You can train the muscles, you can improve the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, the heart increases, but the lungs are the same. So it's very important that we look after this part of the horse's physiology. So looking at clinical signs of severe equine asthma and indeed inflammatory airway disease, what is it that most owners come and say that their horses are suffering from? Well, first of all, the most common thing is loss of performance or a slow recovery rate. So people will say, he's not galloping as enthusiastic, he's lost the enthusiasm for his work. Or if you're actually monitoring your fitness regime, which you should be doing so, and you're looking at how effective horses are getting back to resting heart levels, then once they start to suffer from some sort of respiratory problem, they will have much slower recovery rates. And so you should pick that up fairly early on when either your horse has reached a plateau or indeed the recovery rate is starting to increase and instead of decrease. The other thing that you start to see, and now we're getting closer to severe equine asthma, is that horses will start to cough and you will see mucus coming through down through the nose. Now all of that is the reaction, the hypersensitivity reaction that causes hyperplasia of goblet cells. That means you've got more submucosal glands, you get more and thicker mucus, and you get the dysfunction of the cilia simply because they're clogged up with mucus. They can't beat, and you will see compromised lungs. Instead of all the cilia sitting up and facing and beating in nice one direction, they're all twisted and the beating is a lot less effective. And so that compounds the problem because any dust that does go into the lungs is not taken out. It sits there because the cilia aren't beating correctly. Lots of mucus in the lungs, and particularly in those very small air sacs in the alveoli, cause bronchoconstriction. So it's literally sticking those little air sacs together, and so they can't expand and contract in the way that they should. The other thing that we notice is neutrophilia. Now, neutrophilia is simply the percentage of neutrophils that are found in the bronchoalveolar lavage or the bowel fluid. horses that have got greater than 20% neutrophilia are diagnosed as having inflammatory airway disease. If horses have severe equine asthma, so they're quite a bit further down this hypersensitivity action, they may have 50 to 70%. But the problem with this particular diagnostic test, and it's the one thing that the veterinary profession do use a little bit, but they themselves will say to you that it's not cut and dried, because there have been cases of horses with up to 30% neutrophilia who are not showing any loss of performance or any coughing or any mucus. Whereas other horses, maybe down at 10 or 15%, are showing loss of performance and coughing. So it's more of a guide than it is actually diagnosis. But all of these things put together will cause reduced dynamic lung compliance and increased pulmonary resistance. And all of those things stop the lungs from expanding and contracting as they should. But it also, there's a barrier, this thick mucus is a barrier as well for the oxygen that does get in there to actually go across the alveolar cells and into the bloodstream. So you've basically got a double whammy going on here, that it's causing, the problem causes a lack of oxygen, the lack of oxygen causes the problem a bit more, and so it perpetuates. So I've been mentioning several times about hypersensitivity, and just to remind ourselves about what hypersensitivity is, the official definition is a state of altered reactivity in which the body reacts with an exaggerated immune response to a foreign agent. Now, what that means is that once the foreign agent, and whatever dust it might be, we all know that Aspergillus fumigatus is a classic fungal allergen for horses with this condition. So that goes into the body and the lung tissue, and it is recognized as not normal. It shouldn't be in there. So in the attempt to try and get rid of it, the body produces a normal reaction to inflammatory reaction, which it would to any other type of infection. But the problem with the hypersensitivity is that it's an overreaction. And what's more, once the horse becomes hypersensitized to this, he is hypersensitized for the rest of his days. Now, you can make horses asymptomatic if you separate that horse-dust interaction. So if you take away the offending bedding, you clean up the stable environment, you don't feed it dry hay, or you turn them out, or you use different types of stabling. So they can be pretty much become asymptomatic, so they have got pretty much normal lung function. But the moment they become in contact with that dust again, then they will set up this hypersensitivity reaction. And it seems that each time horses get this, they react even more strongly and even more strongly. So instead of saying, well, my horse doesn't cough, so I'm not worried about the environment, worry about the environment and clean it up now so that you actually don't get hypersensitivity. Because once you do, the horse is hypersensitized for the rest of his life. In case you haven't seen what severe equine asthma looks like, I just thought I would play this little video just to show. You can see the abdomen of the horse is contracting as he's breathing. Also, that breathing rate is really quite fast. Now, this is we'll just have a look at that again. So this is the muscles that are the abdominal muscles that have been used to force and push the air out of the lungs. And that is called a Heaves Line. And that's quite classic. And you can see in that the horse is actually quite stressed. He's breathing quite quickly and trying to get oxygen in, and he's just standing there. He's not even working. So you can imagine the stress these animals are under when they're asked to work with any level of respiratory disorder. So I said at the beginning that our group have been looking at environmental dust. And the work to date has suggested that it's airborne respirable dust from hay and straw and the stable environment. But that dust has to be 5 microns and less to be problematic to the horse, because that's what gets breathed down deep into the lungs. So starting off looking at what other workers have found, we found that beta glucans, which are on the surface of plant cells, they are also constituents in bacteria cells, they can produce the hypersensitivity reaction, as indeed do dust mites. Humans are very allergic to dust mites as well. So dust mites and mite feces and mite legs and heads, etc. Every bit of the mite, it seems, is potentially allergenic. We've also known for quite a long time that mold spores, particularly the Aspergillus genus, and there's a lot of different ones in that horses are showing allergic reactions to. Some workers have also found that bacteria spores are problematic, particularly Saccharopolysporophyni and Thermoactinomyces vulgaris. These are the two very small particle sizes you can see there. You've got 1.91 and 0.58 microns in size. However, some work has shown that when particles are this small, they go into the lungs, but they get carried out in the air that's expired as well. And it might be why later on, and I'll say in our study, we didn't actually find these to be problematic for the horse. It doesn't mean they're not, because some people have found they are. But the very, very small particles sometimes stay in air suspension, so they go in and they go out again, whereas the slightly bigger ones will actually settle down once the breath has gone deep into the lungs. The other thing that's been found to more recently to be allergenic for horses is lipopolysaccharides, and this is a coat on gram-negative bacteria. Now, lipopolysaccharides, in fact, actually upregulate the horse's reaction to things like Aspergillus. So they make the situation a lot worse. Up until Sam's work, pollen, which was mostly greater than 6 microns in size, was deemed not problematic. Thought, well, these aren't going to go into the lungs, deep into the lung tissue. So really, and pollens are in the air all the time and horses are breathing these in. So if they were that allergic to them, they'd all be allergic and they'd all be coughing. And so they're not a problem. Wrong. They are a problem. And we have found this with the microarray work that I'm going to tell you about. So horses are actually quite allergic to certain pollens. So some of this work where previous workers have looked at these individual agents, so decided to study individual fungi or bacteria, they've used the ELISA technique and what they call an antigen down ELISA technique. So this is enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. And what is done there is that it looks very like a normal microscope slide, is coated with the antigen or with the offending protein that's associated with that particular organism. And then people have used either serum, or they have also used bronchoalveolar lavage fluid, and having diluted it and purified it, etc., this is then put onto the plate. And if you have got immunoglobulin IgE that is specific for that particular antigen, it will link to that antigen. And then you put in a little enzyme or a phosphorus or a peroxide or whatever it might be, and it glows. And you say, well, okay, yes, there's a link there. We know that we have got antibody to that antigen. The trouble with that, though, is that it's actually quite labor intense, because you can only screen for one single antigen at a time. So the previous work has shown that that's allergen-specific immunoglobulin E, IgE, in bronchoalveolar lavage fluid of horses that have shown clinical signs of severe equine asthma are mainly fungi. Now that could just be that they were looking at fungi, and as I said, each one of these is an individual ELISA test, which can take quite a while. The top one, that's Micropolysporophyna Saccharomyces rectovirgula. It's had been renamed several times. That's actually a bacteria, but all the rest are fungi. So that's what we were fairly confident, or the industry is fairly confident, that horses are allergic to. However, when happily we were able to work with our colleagues in Nottingham University, And Professor Duncan Hannant and Marcus Alcacer had actually worked on a big European project looking at wild animals and trying to identify diseases in wild animals. And they had used a protein microarray technique for profiling of immunoglobulin E. And so they thought that we could use this technique with horses. So Sam went up to Nottingham and worked for a year and a half there trying to make the microarray, and successfully making the microarray technique work. So what he did was he took 384 extracts of pure proteins on an antigen, and he put them on the slide. So you can see the slide here on the right-hand side. These are specific little pads, and each of those pads contains 200 to 400 micro size spots. So lots and lots of spots, and each of them are individual pure proteins, because it's the protein that's extracted from the allergen that is what the horse puts up the IgE to. So some of the ones that were associated with the stable environment were not available commercially. So Sam had to do a lot of sampling and taking dust levels and then trying to distill and separate dust and dilute it at the right stage so that we could actually find the protein. Many of the plates, so 380 of these proteins on the plate, of course, many of them horses were not allergic to, but we didn't know that until we tested it. So the slides were prepared, and the spot size is 200 microns. There was the same size spacing, and it was replicated twice across the slide. So basically we had a whole range of them down the left-hand side, and then it was mirrored by the right-hand side of the slide. So each one of these slides actually contained 12,288 spots. So you can see we had big scope to identify each of these, any of these allergens that horses were potentially allergic to. So essentially on these plates, on these microarrays, it's a bit like a sophisticated and miniature ELISA on each one. So each one is very carefully dotted with a particular antigen, and then you take the IgE, and in this case, we did the serum extracts from 6 controlled and 6 severe equine asthma horses, and we also did bowel fluid. Now, bowel fluid can be a bit difficult to work with because of dilution levels, etc. But previous workers have found that it's more effective at identifying IgE. So we wanted to see, could we effectively find a way of diluting equine serum, so taking blood samples and seeing if we could pick up the IgE in the blood without having to do a bronchoalveolar lavage. So they've then got a mouse anti-horse IgE, and then this is your conjugate, your fluorescent, which actually glows in the dark, and then you can, glows in the plate, and then you put it into a plate reader, and you can actually see what antibody has been produced by the horse to individual antigens. So in this picture, you see this very precise technique. Now, you can make these slides up by hand, but actually you can get them commercially printed. So you just say what antigens you want on the plate, and they are very precisely put onto this. And so it's really micro work. So over the course of these 18 months, Sam spotted hundreds of protein molecules. All these were purified proteins from allergens associated with a stable environment on a slide, so that we could see if we could find out what was making horses cough and come up with this allergic reaction. So we used horse IgE from both serum and BALF, and we had matched control samples. So it was important for us to actually know that there were horses that were reacting to that environment, and there were the similar horses that were in that environment that weren't reacting. And that was the discrimination, the essential discrimination in the beginning, to find out about the equine asthma. And so the interaction is measured by this fluorescence, this bright, and you can see here, this is sort of the picture that you see when you do the fluorescence. So you can actually see what particular antigens this horse is putting up antibody immunoglobulin 2. And at the end of that study, these were the allergens that he found. And within just 6 horses within one stable environment, this is what horses were allergic to. So we had a series of arthropods. So there was various mites and mite bits. There was aspergillus, so quite some fungi. But there was also some pollens associated that were causing allergic reactions. So that rather waved flags for us, and we thought, right, okay, this is very interesting because people haven't found IgE to pollens before. Now, it could have just been that they hadn't tested them before. But in just that one microarray, he was able to come up with significantly more organisms and things that horses were allergic to. What was also interesting in this study was that horses were putting up IgE, so those horses that were reactive with severe equine asthma, they were also reacted to what humans react to with asthma. So we had a couple of different sorts of dust mite, cockroaches, and fungi, just a different species there of aspergillus. So, and this actually didn't surprise me because about sort of 4 or 5 years ago, we did a 1,000+ survey of horse owners in the UK. And we asked them how many of them actually suffered from some sort of compromised respiratory function, respiratory disorder. And over 40% did. So it's not surprising really here that horses and humans are reacting to very similar types of dust. But at the end of this work, Sam was able to say that we identified a number of novel allergens, so things that hadn't been identified before, but also he found the link between severe equine asthma and pollen sensitization. So we're saying that horses were actually sensitized to certain pollens. And then in the next study, I'll show you what they were and the range of them. But within this study, this was also a breakthrough in it for the early stages of diagnostic techniques, because he found, using this very specific micro technique, that he could pick up the same levels of IgE in serum as he could from bronchoalveolar lavage. Now that makes testing hugely easier, because you don't have to sedate the horse and you don't have to put down an endoscope. And some horses really don't react very well to that. And you can't do that the day before they're racing or they're in the middle of a competition season. And they have to have a few days off after and around that. So, and the other problem with it is to actually transport BALF to and get it to a lab is much more complex than using serum. So just taking a small blood sample, we were able to identify the severe equine asthma. Protein microarrays are highly successful now for large-scale IgE mapping of allergens encountered by horses. So we can, if you like, scan the environment for a lot more of these allergens and be able to pick up what horses are allergic to. So this technology really provided the initiation, the start of the platform for developing specific diagnosis. And that means that you can improve the management of your horse and indeed the treatment of severe equine asthma. Because if you know what your horse is allergic to, you can find what is actually putting that allergen into the environment and remove it from the horse. So you might decide that certain types, even certain types of haylage might hold, I mean, haylage is quite high in pollens, and it might actually be the thing that horse is allergic to. So you don't feed that horse haylage, but it's okay on hay, and vice versa. The other thing is that early identification of this means that you can take horses out of, you don't have to hypersensitize them to the same extent. So you stop them going down that route into severe equine asthma. Some horses that are allergic to certain tree pollens, we found, and we've had this lots of times where people are saying, my horse coughs in May or he coughs in June. And that's because that particular pollen is out because the flowers in that tree are flowering. So in that sort of circumstance, you might actually decide to keep the horse in and to ventilate the building a different way, and certainly make sure that that tree isn't growing outside the window of that horse's stable. So there's lots of very sound reasons and much more specific individual horse diagnosis that can be done with this technique. So having first of all sort of built up the technique and found that we could effectively elucidate a whole range of different allergens, we decided to go ahead and look at a bigger group of horses. So basically seeing our horses in France, the United States and Canada, were they allergic to the same sort of things, or is it very environmental specific? So again, to try and discriminate between horses that had severe equine asthma and those that didn't react, they were all kept in the same environment. So we had equal numbers, except in France, we were down one severe equine asthma horse, but basically there were 6 controls and 6 severe equine asthma in each stables. And what we were able to do then is to test and see what they were allergic to, what they were putting up IgE to. Then the second part of that study, we then took serum samples, and all of this is done in serum because that was so much easier to transport and much more effective and easier to deal with. So we then took 138 horses from all sorts of different environments, and they had a range of different problems. So we had 33 horses that were diagnosed with severe equine asthma alone. There were 23 that had both insect bite hypersensitivity and severe equine asthma. Now, there's quite a lot of literature, and the jury's a little bit out on that one about whether horses are more susceptible to severe equine asthma if they've IBH and the other way around. Some people have found no link, and I suspect it's something to do with the particular allergens that those horses are allergic to. Then we had 24 that were just insect bite hypersensitive. So we wanted to see, was this test specific enough to be able to separate horses with 2 different types of allergens and what they were allergic to. And then we had 58 controls, so dotted around here where they were in similar sort of environments and but not causing any, not producing any respiratory disorder. And we had samples from 4 different countries across the world. So we had France, Switzerland, United States, and Canada. So this was a major study that on the second part of his PhD. Looking at the results then, part 1, which we would describe as the calibration model, this showed that it is feasible to discriminate severe equine asthma from control animals. So you don't have to actually know what is in that environment, because you pick it up and we say, well, if horses have got severe equine asthma, they will show very clearly that you will pick up on these microarrays what they're actually allergic to. So that was quite a relief that we didn't have to screen the environment first of all. The second part then, the modeling part with the 138 horses, that confirmed that we had good prediction for severe equine asthma with non-matched samples. So what that suggested to us then was that you could take this microarray and you could go to any stable and you could take a serum sample from the horse and process it, and you would find out what it is allergic to. Now, there might be a little caveat there in the fact that maybe all the different organisms that's possible to be in every single stables in the world is not on that microarray. So it's only as good as what antigens are put on the microarray. But with such a large number of different proteins on the plate, we are largely able to pick these up. We were also able to discriminate between allergic disorders. So horses that were insect bite hypersensitive was producing different IgE to those that were severe equine asthma. And we could actually see what it was that they were allergic to. So that was a great relief. And it also shows the specificity of this particular test. But this was the most surprising thing that we found, is that the most influential class separation, what I mean by that was that if you are going to pick up what horses are allergic to, severe equine asthma horses are allergic to, the one thing that they will always be allergic to is natural rubber latex. Now, when you think about it, you think, well, why would they be allergic to rubber? And then you stop and think, well, actually, we ride them on artificial surfaces. We gallop them on artificial surfaces. And those animals that are kept in urban environments, there's traffic and rubber tire bits, etc., in the environment all the time. And I suspect that that is why horses that are in urban environments are more susceptible to severe equine asthma, because they're continually being challenged by latex rubber. So that has quite severe implications for working horses in dusty environments on these artificial surfaces. So this class separation aspect was showing that if you had only had an ELISA, if you had only had one ELISA test that you could do, the best thing that you could test to see if your horse has actually just got a cough or whether he is hypersensitized is put rubber on the plate, because that is the most common allergen and the most specific allergen for horses that have got severe equine asthma. The fact that they're allergic to lots of other things as well, so you don't actually know what else you need to take out of the environment. But if you want to see, have they got an allergic reaction, test for rubber. Better if you can do the microarray completely. So just to give you an idea of all the sorts of things that horses are allergic to, and I've just highlighted the ones that we'd found in this study. So we knew, and other people had found, that various dust mites and fungus and certain bacteria horses are allergic to. But what we didn't know until this study were these particular pollens. Now, the ones that I have highlighted here in purple and yellow, and all the ones in yellow are the rubber, different types of rubber. But so if your horse has got severe equine asthma, you'll be maybe pretty sure that he will react to these organisms. So we've got 3 tree pollens in there. So we've got cypress, hazel pollen, and cedar, juniper cedar trees. So that was quite a surprise, because the pollens are bigger than this cutoff or previously regarded cutoff of 5 microns. More specifically then, just the range of fungi that these horses were allergic to. Yes, we found pretty much similar to what previous workers had found, although we did find quite a few more as well. So these ones are new ones. Alternaria, some of them we'd known about. Cladosporium we didn't know about. Eurotium we didn't know about. So Aspergillus, oh sorry, we didn't know about Eurotium, yes, but Aspergillus we knew, but there was more Aspergillus than previously identified. In our over 138 samples, we only found 3 bacteria that horses were putting up IgE to. And oddly enough, in our samples, we did not find the ones that were highlighted previously. So we did not find that T. vulgaris and S. phenai were allergens for this group of horses. Now, that doesn't mean to say that previous work has been wrong. It just means that in those environments, those 2 organisms were obviously not setting up the allergic reaction. I think I would always leave it on the microarray plate, though, because they are very small spores and they have been identified previously as problematic. Looking then at also the arthropods, here is the whole range of arthropods. So actually these creepy crawlies, these midges and cockroach bits and mite bits, etc., horses are pretty allergic to those, as indeed are humans. So we've got quite a series of arthropods. And although I highlighted the ones that were most allergic in our group, that were the biggest class separation ones, look at the range of pollens here that horses are allergic to. So we've got trees, but we've also got grass pollens. Now that's not good news for us, really, putting our horses out. So it might be that some horses who are coughing and they're out at grass in the summertime, they might be allergic to the pollen of Yorkshire fog and perennial ryegrass, and that's timothy. So, and there's Festuca, that's another very common one. Ragweed shouldn't be anywhere near horses anyhow because it's poisonous, but nonetheless, the pollens from that, horses were putting up immunoglobulin E to these particular pollens. So that was this was quite a finding really, and it just was down to the fact that we were able to put so many different proteins on the plate. We were also able to find that there was a huge number of these similarities between human asthma and farmer's lung and horses. So we found that these were all allergens for horses. They are known to be allergens in asthma, and they're also known to be problematic for people with farmer's lung. Farmer's lung is very similar in that it's this hypersensitivity reaction, and it comes from being in very dusty environments. So, in conclusion, after all that and 3 years or so of work, the most significant finding here really was that there were different allergens involved than previously thought. And the major finding, which nobody had thought to test for before, was latex. So we need to be very aware what type of rubber we are putting and type of substance we are putting on our artificial surfaces, because we could be setting up our horses when they're working and taking deep breaths and etc., that they are being exposed to a strong allergen for respiratory disorder. Tree pollens are also, as I said, a strong allergen, and therefore, again, to know what your horse is allergic to, and then perhaps not to turn them out in particular fields, or indeed not turn them out over a particular time when that pollen is high in the air. And so to know what your horse is allergic to is very powerful in the management of this condition. So horse-specific diagnosis will help you identify problems and help you clean up the stable environment and choose the best feed for your horse. Early identification of susceptible horses and quick intervention by implementing preventative measures such as taking the hay out, taking the straw out, closing the window to the cypress tree, not brushing horses indoors, not having cars driving up and down with rubber tires just outside the stables, so that you actually can keep the environment as clean as possible. So Sam's work has really given us a lot more to think about in terms of managing these horses and managing respiratory health. So our takeaway of what message really is the same as it has always been, and many veterinary scientists have said this, that allergen avoidance is the cornerstone of prevention and effective treatment. So try not to actually subject your horse to these allergens. Reduce the horse to airborne respirable dust interaction wherever possible. Knowledge is power. If you know what your horse is allergic to, take it out of the environment. And the efficacy of their approach relies on the identification of causal allergens. And we do find that horses are allergic to different things. Some of them, there's some very strong threads, such as certain pollens, certain fungi, and of course latex, that run through them all. But certain horses will be more or less allergic to other organisms. And to know what it is able to take that out of the environment. So I would like to thank the co-workers on this project, Dr. Sam White, who successfully completed his PhD and did all the work, and my very clever collaborators, Dr. Marcus Alcacer and Duncan Hannon from Nottingham University. We were very lucky to have collaborators who sent us samples from all their herds. So Dr. Elaine Marty, Dr. Eric Richards, and Dr. Laurent Coutel. So they were very helpful with sending samples to us. And I would like to acknowledge the funders. So Haygain and the Fred and Marjorie Sainsbury Trust and the Royal Agricultural University all put funding into this project to allow us to do that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias, doctora Meriel, aunque no esté presente, como siempre abordando los temas con mucha profundidad y mucho profesionalismo. Muchas gracias. Bien, pues a continuación les pediría entonces a al doctor Gustavo Hernández Vidal y a la doctora Elena García Seco, si son tan amables para iniciar la sesión de preguntas y respuestas, por favor. Ok, pues muchas gracias. Una pregunta para el doctor Gustavo Hernández. Mencionan, estas lesiones de las diferentes patologías, ¿también podremos encontrarlas en la práctica diaria de infiltraciones articulares?
Así es, este tipo de problemas los encontramos en la práctica, en la clínica diaria. Y al momento de tomar, por ejemplo, la decisión de infiltrar a un caballo, tenemos que tomar en cuenta principalmente la articulación afectada, ¿sí? Y la sintomatología que presenta el caballo y el grado de afección presente. Pero sí los encontramos frecuentemente, es una de las causas principales por las cuales los caballos se infiltran y no me dejará mentir la doctora Elena.
Sí, justo le iba a pedir también su aportación si pudiera emitirnos un comentario al respecto, porque pues obviamente implica las dos ponencias que ustedes amablemente impartieron y con mucho interés. Ahora les voy a después a comentar todos los comentarios en cuanto en ese sentido de que fueron excelentes ponencias, ¿no? Entonces, doctora Elena, si nos haces por favor, hacer un comentario al respecto. No le escuchamos. Si quieres activar tu micrófono, por favor.
Perfecto, ¿me escuchan?
Excelente.
Sí. Bueno, sí, doctor, muchas gracias. Yo lo único que puedo aportar es que finalmente nosotros vemos como clínicos de caballos al final la consecuencia de problemas que pueden prevenirse, ¿no? Y como lo estamos exhibiendo en estas ponencias, pues sí, o sea, hay problemas en la gestación y problemas después del parto que pueden ser prevenidos. Y cuando vemos un rancho que tiene pues problemas con potros de osteocondrosis, osteocondritis, fisitis, epifisitis, etcétera, o potros neonatos con problemas del desarrollo, bueno, pues yo creo que es importante tener en cuenta que esto puede llegar a suceder y que podemos, pues de manera preventiva, resolverlo, ¿no?
Doctor Sergio, tienes apagado tu micrófono.
Perdón, gracias. Sí, es que mis mascotas estaban vocalizando y entonces sí, con esta nueva situación, entonces hay que tener cuidado. Comentaba yo que me voy a permitir alternar las preguntas para que no sea para un solo ponente. Entonces, la siguiente pregunta es para la doctora Elena García y dicen, ¿han utilizado vendas de kinesiostaping o kinesiostop en deformidades angulares y si tienen algún dato respecto a eso? En su ponencia comentaba algo, pero si quisieras, por favor, ahondar más al respecto, por favor, doctora.
Doctora Elena, tienes apagado el micrófono.
No hay mucha investigación acerca de esto, pero creo que sí sirve, y yo lo he visto que es una terapia que sirve, que podemos poner en articulaciones, sobre todo en articulaciones que tienen flacidez, ¿no? Que están flácidas y que podemos actuar sobre ello. No hay investigación que lo respalde, pero bueno, a mí me ha dado buenos resultados y pues sería un buen tema de investigación, ¿no? Porque finalmente son potros que nacen con flacidez y que podemos ayudarlos con este tipo de terapias. Si alguien está dispuesto a hacer investigación acerca de ello, pues adelante, porque no tenemos investigación, se ha hecho mucho en humanos, no en caballos.
Muchas gracias. Doctor Hernández, ¿quisieras hacer algún comentario adicional a esta pregunta?
Así es. Desafortunadamente yo no tengo experiencia alguna con este tipo de vendajes, entonces no puedo aportar.
No hay problema. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Perdón, es que tengo que ir alternando para que no se me fuera ninguna pregunta.
No
Las
te
copié y las pegué en una página de Word, entonces, perdón.
No te
La
preocupes.
siguiente pregunta para doctor Hernández sería, en casos de osteocondrosis, ¿se recomienda la suplementación con cobre y cuál sería la relación? Aunque no ponen su relación con algún otro
Yo creo que aquí se
mineral.
está refiriendo a la relación con el zinc.
Justo iba yo a comentar eso.
Así es. Entonces, mira, en la dieta de los potros debe de incluir, o sea, raciones limitadas de carbohidratos de fácil digestión para limitar el riesgo del desequilibrio hormonal. Y también tenemos que regular la tasa de crecimiento de animales jóvenes, porque sabemos que uno de los factores importantes que producen problemas de discondroplasia, osteocondrosis, son el rápido crecimiento. La suplementación con cobre es de suma importancia. Inclusive también se debe de dar antes de que nazca el producto, a dosis oral de 0.5 miligramos de sulfato de cobre por kilogramo de peso corporal por día. Esto se debe de incorporar en las yeguas maduras, en donde hay una carencia natural en los pastizales que es muy baja principalmente. Y en las etapas tempranas es conveniente garantizar el acceso a pastos ricos en este mineral a los potros durante su etapa de crecimiento, principalmente, la relación zinc-cobre se maneja de 3:1, de 4:1, etcétera. No sé si alguien de los invitados expertos en nutrición nos pueda enriquecer un poco más, ya que no es mi área de expertise, pero es importante la suplementación de cobre para evitar este tipo de problemas. Lo que yo estuve manejando fue a manera a manera celular, a manera intraarticular principalmente, para ver cuál era el efecto del zinc y del cobre en la degradación de la matriz extracelular del cartílago articular en caballos. Gracias.
Doctor Hernández, yo aquí me voy a permitir preguntarte, ¿qué fuente de cobre utilizan? ¿Únicamente sulfato?
Sí, sulfato.
Por la cuestión de la biodisponibilidad.
Sí, sulfato de cobre.
Y su relación también con aparte de zinc, con molibdeno, también sería importante considerarla, ¿no? No sé si
Así es
algo al respecto.
Qué bueno que lo mencionas, Doc. Así es.
Muchas gracias.
Al contrario.
Doctora Elena, ¿quisieras comentar algo sobre esto? Por favor, tu micrófono, doctora.
Dios.
Sí, es complicado a veces.
Pero bueno, simplemente yo creo que es importante saber que tenemos distintas disciplinas. Yo soy cirujana, yo veo a los potros cuando ya están enfermos, y es a lo que me llaman cuando ya tienen una desviación angular, una deformidad flexural, OCD, ¿no? Y creo que son problemas completamente prevenibles y que como veterinarios, bueno, pues tenemos que ver y incidir en este aspecto, ¿no? En el aspecto de la alimentación, que es importantísima, en el aspecto, pues, del manejo y en el aspecto, obviamente, genético, pero creo que mucho, incluso en México, tiene que ver con el aspecto nutricional. Entonces, pues, ¿qué puedo decir y qué puedo aportar? Pues creo que hay que incidir en este tipo de prácticas en donde tenemos bueno, pues que ver cuáles aspectos nos corresponden como veterinarios, que vemos un poco todos los aspectos generales de un sitio. No sé si me entiendan, pero creo que tenemos que incidir en estos aspectos reproductivos, nutricionales y genéticos, ¿no? Y bueno.
Tu micrófono.
Perdón, sí. Hay un comentario en relación a esta relación de cobre, zinc, molibdeno de parte de la doctora Ramírez, que comenta ella que incluso, perdón, que zinc, cobre y manganeso deben estar los tres, incluso el hierro, ¿no? Ella hace comentarios sobre este aspecto de la relación entre los microminerales, ¿no?
Muchas gracias.
Hay otra pregunta para ti, doctor Hernández, que nos dice, doctor Hernández, excelente charla. ¿Qué pronóstico tendría una cría de frisón de 1 año de edad con osteocondrosis en la cresta intermedia de la tibia y aparte de ver el balance del cobre, y aparte de que el balance del cobre esté correcto, ¿con qué más se puede suplementar?
Bueno, la prognosis depende principalmente de la severidad y extensión de la lesión principalmente. La prognosis es buena porque estamos hablando de un animal relativamente, un animal joven. Se puede corregir quirúrgicamente, pero aquí, que me corrija la doctora Elena, tenemos que tener cuidado, tomar en cuenta que ser cuidadosos porque el hueso subcondral se encuentra blando. Se puede suplementar con manganeso, zinc, siguiendo las recomendaciones del NRC, o también es importante acudir con un especialista de la nutrición, principalmente. Pero yo creo que una cría de frisón es un animal relativamente joven y su prognosis es buena.
Doctora Elena, si quisieras aportar algo más.
Yo lo único que digo es, y lo reitero, es finalmente estos problemas que vemos en ranchos en donde es una lesión pues que sigue pasando, ¿no? Durante el tiempo, y vemos estos potros que tienen desviaciones angulares o deformidades flexurales o OCD, y que vemos que tienen un semental, que es el semental estrella, pero que sigue criando este tipo de potros. O sea, tenemos que tener mucho cuidado cuando estamos observando problemas e identificando problemas en un rancho en específico, con lesiones específicas, saber o intentar identificar qué es lo que está pasando. ¿Es un problema genético? ¿Es un problema de nutrición? ¿O es un problema relacionado con el ejercicio, no? Y entonces, bueno, pues hay que identificar como veterinarios qué es lo que sucede para tratar de solucionar el problema. Yo en estos casos de OCD, yo comentaba en mi plática que, bueno, hay que esperar a que sean, pues más o menos de un año, no operarlos antes, pero pues con las consecuencias que ello conlleve, ¿no? En cuestión genética, nutricional, y si es un semental o un potro que se va a dedicar con este fin.
Ok, muchas gracias. Hay peticiones reiteradas de tanto para el doctor Hernández como para la doctora Elena de que si podrían brindar su correo electrónico ya que les interesa comunicarse con ustedes.
Ah, sí, claro que sí.
Entonces, si la organización nos ayuda en ese sentido de ponerlos en el chat para que esté al alcance de las diversas personas. Bien, vuelven a preguntar que si fuera tan amable el doctor Hernández de volver a repetir la dosis de sulfato de cobre. Doctor, tu micrófono, por favor.
No.
Ya, me pasó. Faltaba yo. Sí, la suplementación para las yeguas es una dosis oral de 5 miligramos de sulfato de cobre por kilogramo de peso corporal por día, ¿sí? Esto también, y la relación sin cobre es de 3 a 1 y de 4 a 1. Son los rangos que se manejan, pero pues eso, también checarlo con un experto en nutrición, ya que esa no es mi área de expertise, ¿sí me explico? Pero...
Muchas gracias. Hay una pregunta que no especifica para quién, pero tal vez los dos nos pueden apoyar en ese sentido. ¿Hay alguna clasificación de osteoartritis a nivel radiográfico?
Osteoartritis a nivel radiográfico.
Sí. ¿Hay alguna clasificación de osteoartritis a nivel radiográfico? Y es lo único que preguntan.
Debe de, inclusive hay clasificación de problemas de osteocondrosis a nivel radiográfico. Diferentes grados se manejan de grado 0, grado 1, grado 2 y grado 3. Principalmente, entonces, yo creo que debe de haber una clasificación radiográfica con problemas osteoartríticos. Sería nada más cuestión de echarnos un clavado en algún libro de imagenología diagnóstica.
Claro. Ok, permítanme. Para la doctora Elena, preguntan, ¿cuál es el mecanismo de acción de la oxitetracyclina para administrarla en deformaciones de extremidades?
Yo no administro oxitetracyclina, sé que hay muchos doctores que lo hacen, está muy documentado en el mercado y no la administro porque puede llegar a causar problemas renales, ¿no? En los potros. No he visto muchos resultados porque todos los potros que me llegan al hospital les han administrado oxitetracyclina y no hay resultados aparentes. Generalmente, como lo expliqué en la plática, que el calcio y entonces tiene una relajación muscular evidente. Hay que tener mucho cuidado, ¿no? En la dosis que aplicamos y en el intervalo de dosis, si es que llegamos a aplicarlo. Es una opinión personal, a mí yo no la aplico, no me gusta, pero ahí está en el mercado y la pueden aplicar con las dosis convenientes, con cuidado, ¿sí? Porque puede causar, y eso que lo tengan en cuenta, que puede causar un problema renal agudo. en potros neonatos.
Ok, muchas gracias. Una siguiente pregunta para la doctora Elena. Mencionan, bueno, aparte de felicitarla, de muy buena ponencia y otra para ustedes, dicen que los ama, que los aman todos. Comentarios muy motivantes. Preguntan, para la doctora Elena, una pregunta, ¿han usado o pensado en usar férulas en 3D?
Pues sí y no. Yo creo que dependiendo del tipo de problema que tenga el potro, ¿no? O sea, yo creo que es importante cada vez irnos actualizando en lo que está sucediendo en el mundo. Estas férulas 3D nos dan una buena opción. No las conozco así a rajatabla, pero yo creo que pueden ser una buena opción y puede ser un buen comienzo para utilizar otro tipo de ferulización y contención en los caballos y potros. Si alguien tiene una idea, háganmela saber. Encantada.
Ok, muchas gracias. Una pregunta más para ti, doctora. ¿Existe alguna relación entre las deformaciones angulares o flexurales de los potros y el estado nutricional de la yegua durante la gestación?
Sí, bueno, pues como expliqué, obviamente hay procesos, ya sea sobrepeso o malnutrición en la yegua, hay muchísimos aspectos que se pueden relacionar con el estado en el que nace el potro. Y lo que tenemos como veterinarios que cuidar, veterinarios no, que no nos dedicamos a la reproducción o no nos dedicamos a este tipo de prácticas, si somos veterinarios comunes que atendemos emergencias como yo, en donde atendemos pues más cólicos o cosas de otro tipo y nos llegan yeguas pues con problemas de gestación, distocias, lo que sea. Yo creo que lo que tienen que cuidar es una alimentación y una adecuada medicación, ya sea de, pues no sé, de vacunación o desparasitación adecuada en el momento adecuado que se tenga que dar a la yegua. Y obviamente porque si vemos todos estos problemas actúan, y yo lo que veo en general son los problemas, ¿no? Ya sea por problemas durante la gestación o problemas después de la gestación, y veo problemas en el potro. Entonces, lo que tenemos que cuidar es antes de la gestación, pues sí, o sea, problemas en cuanto a medicación, desparasitación, vacunación, antes del parto y después de este. Y todo lo que hablaban en esta etapa, tanto el doctor Santiago como la doctora Gaby, en cuanto a minerales y todos los nutrimentos, el doctor Elías, ¿no? Es súper importante todo eso, tomarlo a consideración para poder tener un parto adecuado y que el potro tenga una alimentación y un desarrollo adecuado.
Ok, gracias. Hay un comentario reciente con relación a lo que ya comentaste, doctora, en relación a las dosis de tetraciclinas, ¿no? Entonces, solamente están comentando que se utilizan en bajas dosis. Y hay otro comentario para el doctor Hernández, seguramente porque dice, ¿la falta de sulfato de cobre puede generar problemas dermatológicos?
Desconozco, sinceramente. No soy especialista en dermatología, pero no sé si alguien en la audiencia tenga experiencia.
Yo voy a comentar algo, sí está relacionado con problemas de piel, sobre todo por integridad de los epitelios.
Okay.
Y de hecho, la mayoría de las pomadas, por ejemplo, estas pomadas que se utilizan como paliativos para pie de atleta o para problemas de hongos o fungosis, o bien para problemas consecuentes de alguna lesión en la piel, pues tienen pomadas, las pomadas tienen una concentración de sulfato de cobre. No sé si eso ayude para en un momento dado. Hay muchas felicitaciones hacia los dos ponentes diciendo que son excelentes, que pues que ayuda mucho, que esperan que les faciliten las presentaciones para analizarlas posteriormente. Y bueno, creo que hay una última pregunta que vamos a dar lectura. Dice, los productos como la colágena, glucosamina y condroitina, que están de moda en utilizarlos en problemas en humanos, ¿podrían utilizarse cuando se presenta un caso como el de los potrillos prematuros?
Claro, claro. Inclusive se están haciendo estudios en el uso de este tipo de elementos para tratar de este tipo de problemas de desarrollo ortopédico y tratar de mejorar la arquitectura normal del cartílago articular.
Muy bien. Pues
Y,
con esta última respuesta cerramos esta sesión.
uh-huh.
Les vuelvo a reiterar el agradecimiento a los dos, bueno, a los tres, aunque la doctora Meriel no estuvo presente, sin embargo, pues formaron parte de esta sesión número 4. Así es que muchísimas gracias y un agradecimiento eterno por su participación en este.
Quería nada más mencionar.
Sí, adelante, doctora, perdón.
No, porque yo hablaba de los National Concourses, que más que una raza en especial es una disciplina en donde estos caballos son pues generalmente pura sangre inglés y a lo mejor hay una mezcla de razas con pura sangre inglés con otras, pero son caballos que en vez de correr en pista plana, como observamos a nuestros caballos aquí en el hipódromo, pues son caballos que saltan, ¿no? Y tienen zanjas y vallas y en vez de correr 1,5 kilómetros, corren 6,5 kilómetros. Y pues sí, yo es lo que hablaba, ¿no? Son disciplinas distintas, hay que observar esto cuando somos veterinarios, es un punto que yo quiero poner en cuenta para su observación, porque al final el hecho de que tengan disciplinas completamente distintas, pues sí cambia el panorama en cuanto a muchas cosas que hacemos en la medicina veterinaria, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, quería nada más apuntarlo y le agradezco su atención, doctor Sergio.
Con gusto y al contrario, muchísimas gracias por tu reflexión esta última, que es de gran valía. De nueva cuenta, muchas gracias a ustedes dos. Y,
gracias, Doc.
Sí, que estén muy bien y buenas tardes.
Saludos, Elena.
Ay, bye, folks.